We now turn to your favorite historical figure in mind. I'm just joking. But this is, someone who will have a major impact on developments in Europe. Maybe one of the best cases you could make for the importance of an individual in shaping historical events. Most historians are very reluctant to put too much weight on any one individual, tend to look at kind of broader factors with the idea that then, certain individuals end up playing important roles, but if it wasn't them, it very well would have been someone else. Things might have gone a little bit differently, but ultimately roughly the same outcome. If you're going to actually put a lot of importance on one individual, as if to suggest without this individual, history would have taken a completely different course. You might have a good shot of it with Napoleon Bonaparte. Hence why we are focusing on him a bit. But even if, some of these developments would have happened anyway, they are pretty important developments. And he, in as much as how they did actually happen, he played a pretty important role. So we kind of left off with a new government in France, the Directoire, which is going to prove very unpopular. And at this point, Napoleon Bonaparte, a very important general in the French Revolutionary Army, but someone also who's becoming extremely popular as a kind of political figure. And he will end up leading a coup against the Directory on November 9th, 1799. Often the date referred to by the revolutionary calendar, and this is just kind of a convention that has emerged, but you should really know this, right? I mean, because even sometimes this date is used as a synonym for a coup, right? So the coup taking place on the 18th of Brumaire, a month on the revolutionary calendar of year 8. And so, for instance, sometimes we might refer to a different coup as so-and-so's 18th of Brumaire. Just be aware, you might run into that term. And so he ends up basically becoming a dictator, initially as first consul of a newly established French Republic, and that will carry on until 1804, at which point kind of dispensing with the formalities of, somehow a kind of enlightened-based representative government and taking the title of emperor. So how did this coup actually come about? It was actually orchestrated by one of the directors, right? This 5-member committee that has executive power. And it's actually someone who we've encountered before now, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sayes, author of the pamphlet. So this is going back to the beginning of the French Revolution, the pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? And then had been a very prominent member of the National Assembly, and now one of the 5 directors. And among those, many individuals who felt that, this really isn't what the revolution was supposed to be about. Feeling that the promise of the revolution had been betrayed. And so at some point, he's going to reach out to this very, very prominent military figure, someone very popular in France, someone generally reputed to be committed to the values of the revolution, and call upon him to use his position in the military in order to initiate a coup, to take over the government, with the idea that he would then manipulate him from behind the scenes. And in this regard, he probably tremendously underestimated Napoleon. So almost immediately after seizing power, they're going to draft a new constitution. And you might have picked up on the fact that France is going through constitutions, I don't know, the way somebody with a bad cold would go through tissues. But in any event, much to Sayes' surprise, Bonaparte is going to play a very major role in terms of the content of the new constitution, the Constitution of Year 8, which is adopted on December 24th, 1799, and which makes Napoleon first consul, a position which, based on the new constitution, effectively gives him the powers of a dictator. And then he's going to use his position as first consul to further augment his power with the drafting of yet another constitution, that of year 10, 1802, which will see him made first consul for life, and effectively concentrating all power in his hands. So at this point, we might consider something of the background of Napoleon as an individual. So first of all, he truly was a military genius. Usually the debate is between, whether he or Alexander the Great was the greatest military commander of all time. By the way, he was a big fan of Alexander the Great and pretty much saw himself as his modern day incarnation. So he had a big ego, but to some degree justified. So first of all, he demonstrated a remarkable ability to apply his encyclopedic knowledge of conventional military thought to real-world situations, right? So if he studied a battle or a particular strategy or, a historical military commander, it's as if he had a photographic memory, right? I mean, he was able to retain whatever information he had actually taken in. But more importantly, if he was in a particular battle-related situation, he immediately understood which bits of information he had were relevant and exactly how to apply it. I mean, almost as if his mind was a computer, very rapidly formulating the best possible strategy on the basis of the data contained within the file of his mind. And part of this, probably where he most excelled, was in the collecting of intelligence, meaning information about the enemy, and in preventing the enemy from collecting intelligence about him, i.e. deception. So when the time came to fight, if you were the opposing army, it almost felt as if he had a supernatural sense about when best to strike. Right? So, I mean, he knew everything he needed to know about you. You seemingly knew nothing about him. And he had tremendous self-confidence. I mean, whatever his instincts told him to do, he didn't hesitate. And because of that, he almost always won. Right up until the very end, he almost never lost a battle. In fact, you really could say he did never lose a battle. Maybe, at the, the worst case scenario would be something of a stalemate or a tie. And when the actual battle came, it usually involved him concentrating his forces on the unsuspecting enemy. Because he knew everything he needed to know about you, he knew exactly where to situate his men, his artillery, and so forth. You knew very little about him, so you were not prepared. A lot of this involved using spies to gather information about opposing forces. But again, he was very good at concealing information about himself and his own troops. So you really just never saw it coming. And this is really fascinating if you consider that towards the end, he had armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and was able to move them across Europe as if it was an army of mice, where nobody really knew where they were going, how fast they were going, and where they were going to end up. And in many ways, in terms of strategy in particular, Napoleon marked a new era in military history. I mean, the way people fought battles, how they thought about it strategically, everything kind of taking its cue from him moving forward. Now, the other thing we should know about Napoleon, and this kind of informs one of the bigger debates about him, he truly did believe, or at least he claimed to believe in the values represented by the Enlightenment, very often presenting himself as a son of the Enlightenment. And whenever he would conquer territory that would either be, immediately incorporated into France or, would be relegated to a kind of satellite status, he would very quickly impose enlightened reform. Of course, this would have started in France, but then in other territories that came under French control, usually he would follow suit. So what kind of reform are we talking about, right? Some of the more important ones, centralizing of the administration, right? The idea that the administration should function in the same way, that you should have the same kind of offices, the same basic regulations and so forth throughout your territory. A sophisticated tax system. If you think about it, this is perhaps the most important bureaucratic institution. Until you ensure that you have adequate revenue, you can't make other kinds of reforms. The creation of a central bank in order to foster economic growth. Law codes, probably the thing he's most famous for, and we'll look at some of those a bit more closely momentarily. Also developing infrastructure, roads, sewer systems, and so forth, and the provision of higher education. And so I mentioned, that there's this kind of debate about Napoleon, and primarily it is about what chiefly motivated him. Was he motivated primarily by the desire to bring about enlightened reform? Right, so also many territories that he conquered, immediately eliminating any remnants of feudalism, right, and then implementing these reforms that we just talked about. So is that what primarily drove him, or was he primarily about his own power? So if you think about it, a similar debate is the one we had about enlightened absolutists. So historians go back and forth on this. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that he did implement many enlightened reforms, but very often the counter-argument to that would be that that really was primarily about raising revenue in order to support his armies, inculcating within people a sense of devotion and loyalty to Napoleon. And by the way, as Napoleon swept across Europe, there were many non-French Europeans that greatly supported him, that did really think that he was there to, in a sense, liberate Europe from the remnants of feudalism. Some such individuals were quite famous. For instance, Beethoven was a big supporter of Napoleon until he had himself declared emperor. So there is something to be made for the case that he was driven, at least in part, by a desire to bring the Enlightenment to the rest of Europe. And again, these reforms would go well beyond France, as Napoleon conquered other territories in Europe, many of which remained ostensibly independent, but he would implement very similar reforms in these territories as had been carried out in France. And very often this also meant, among other things, reorganizing governments and administrations to bring them in alignment with Enlightenment ideas about representative government, rational administration, so forth, but in a way that would often also undermine existing political elites up until that point, right? So this is also about bringing them more effectively under French control. The one area where perhaps Napoleon didn't demonstrate a complete commitment to the Enlightenment, and where you might actually make a case that this is to some degree really about power, is with the Concordat of 1801, which established a modus vivendi with the church. I mean, there were other reforms as well, but basically redefined the position of the church within France in a way that elevated it somewhat from where it had ended up after the French Revolution, right? So first of all, it reaffirmed the Roman Catholic Church as the established Church of France, and did restore some of its civil status, and also restored some ties to the papacy, but it should be noted, largely in favor of the state. The balance of church-state relations would tilt firmly in Napoleon Bonaparte's favor. And why do I say this might be an indication that some of this reform is driven by power? Napoleon recognized that actually, having a good relationship with the church could also be to his benefit. The church could be a very powerful mechanism for maintaining influence and even a degree of authority with the great masses of French people, many of whom were very Catholic, right? But, as long as you assure that the church was essentially under your thumb. It might also reflect that he came from, socially speaking, a somewhat conservative background. A very large Italian family from Corsica, his Italian name originally Napoleone di Bonaparte. Corsica, shortly before his birth, having been taken over by France. He certainly had very conservative attitudes about the place of women, about kind of traditional family, things that would have aligned quite nicely with certain views that were actively promoted by the church. So that might have been part of it. And then on the other side of the ledger, in support of, the idea that Napoleon was truly committed to enlightened reforms, would probably be the legal reforms he initiated, many of which, even if not reflecting sincere intent, have definitely had a long-term impact, even until today, right? If we look at modern-day legal codes in Europe, they still bear the mark of these reforms. The two most important would have been the Napoleonic Code or Civil Code, And, of course, he didn't, carry out this reform on his own. It's kind of like what happened with Catherine the Great. You appoint a commission, you kind of define the basic terms or the basic principles that you want the reform to adhere to, and then you let a group of individuals focus on it and come up with the details that are then implemented. Probably the most important individual in this regard would have been the second consul, so someone pretty high, pretty high rank, someone who would have had a close relationship with Napoleon, one Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, and it's worth mentioning his name because he really should get, in some ways, the lion's share of the credit for the Napoleonic Code. The other very important legal reform would have been the Code of Criminal Instruction, published in 1808, which basically focused more on judicial procedure and sought to preserve personal freedoms and to remedy the prosecutorial abuses that up until then were all too common, right? So to put it in layman's terms, to ensure that people who were on trial were treated relatively fairly and justly and consistently. And, up until then, that often was not the case. So, again, for a while, and we should know, right from the start, Napoleon is continuously at war with the rest of Europe. What had been the French Revolutionary Wars eventually becoming the Napoleonic Wars. Kind of hard to say exactly, at what point the one became the other. But, at some point, Napoleon is going to have himself made emperor. And many of those who supported him, particularly outside of France, are going to be dreadfully disappointed. I already mentioned Beethoven. He had written a composition in honor of Napoleon. He immediately changed the name of the composition and, disassociated it with Bonaparte. He was so, just disillusioned by the fact that Napoleon declared himself emperor. Bonaparte gave the excuse that, listen, the rest of Europe is never going to accept me until I make myself a monarch. Until that happens, they're still going to be hoping to restore the Bourbon dynasty, i.e. the ruling dynasty, last represented by Louis the 16th. And, maybe if I make myself like a king, kind of go old school on this, the rest of Europe will finally accept me. One has to be a bit skeptical. Napoleon was an incredibly intelligent individual. Surely he would have realized the problem was not about him not being a king, right? There was a concern about the spread of the French Revolution, and certainly some felt that, that was part of what he was doing and something they weren't necessarily happy about. But ultimately, this is a balance of power issue. France is simply becoming too powerful, and the rest of Europe is never going to accept him, especially Great Britain, which at this point has become the chief source of revenue for funding opposition to Napoleon. We'll get to that momentarily. But this isn't going to solve the problem. In any case, Napoleon has himself crowned emperor on December 2nd, 1804 at the Notre Dame, the main cathedral in Paris. With the Pope attending, by the way, though, Napoleon makes a point of taking the crown from the Pope and putting it on his own head, as a way of kind of indicating that the state had power over the church, not the other way around. Shortly thereafter, Napoleon has himself crowned King of Italy at the cathedral in Milan on May 26, 1805. And, from this point on, he is going to start acting a bit more like a conventional monarch, even thinking about, using marriage as a way of making an alliance with the Austrian Empire, for instance, and definitely is going to start imposing members of his family as monarchs on various territories that he conquers. So as if trying to create a Bonaparte dynasty. And as you might imagine, this is not going to go over too well, but we'll get to that shortly. In any event, here we see the crowning of Napoleon with his then one true love, Josephine. Some of you might have heard of her, a very passionate love affair, though eventually he's going to toss her aside. I should note that she really didn't care that much for him and was probably just using him as a way to advance her own position. But in any event, here we see them during better days. With him being crowned, you can see the Pope standing behind him and Napoleon holding the crown that he is about to place on his own head. So as I mentioned, probably the driving force behind opposition to Napoleon, and this opposition usually takes the form of various coalitions of different European powers coming together in opposition to Napoleon. Not always the same countries, but Great Britain is always there, right? Great Britain is always there, encouraging resistance to France and funding it. Britain will subsidize the various coalitions against Napoleon. And you might remember we briefly discussed how during the Seven Years' War, when Britain has subsidized the Prussians in order to fight on their behalf on land, the British do not have a large army. This is basically how they operate. They pay other people to do their fighting for them on land. In the meantime, they have this amazing navy, which in this case they use to harass French shipping and also attack the French coastline, also French colonies in the Caribbean. And so this next slide, I put together a few of the anti-Napoleon coalitions. This is how historians often group them. You have kind of the first coalition lasting between 1792 to 1797, second coalition lasting from 1798 to 1801, third coalition, so forth. I have no expectation that you memorize these. I just wanted to illustrate that a kind of pattern has emerged, right? So basically what happens with each coalition, at some point Napoleon defeats them. There's usually some great battle that takes place that kind of brings it to an end. Eventually a treaty is negotiated that is pretty favorable to Napoleon, but sometimes someone else might get something out of it. Things settle down briefly, but then inevitably a new coalition takes shape, again being promoted and funded by Great Britain. Fighting commences. Napoleon wins a series of battles. Again, there's another treaty kind of settling affairs temporarily. But then a third coalition will arise, and then a fourth coalition, a fifth coalition, so forth. And at some point, Napoleon realizes the only way to end the war, right, to bring fighting to an end, and it's never going to involve him surrendering. And, in fairness, if you're winning battles all the time, why would you do that? But how do you get the other side to accept defeat? And he understands the driving force behind all of this is Great Britain. If he doesn't get Great Britain to surrender, this is never going to stop. The question was, how do you do that? Now, for Napoleon, probably the preferred course of action would be to launch an invasion and just simply overpower the British with his far superior army. The problem with that is you have to cross the English Channel. And, looking at a map, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't look like it should constitute a major obstacle, but it's actually a pretty difficult crossing, particularly as part of a military operation. First of all, very, very tricky currents. Very often, wind is moving in various directions. This is before steamships. You also, when you're approaching the British Isle, you're coming up on the cliffs of Dover, meaning that the opposition would have the high ground. So Napoleon does actually plan for, and then finally you'd have to deal with the Royal Navy. And while the French definitely had a superior army, the French fleet, pretty much one-on-one with the Royal Navy, really no chance of success. Nonetheless, Napoleon did actually kind of plan for an invasion of the British Isles, but in the end it proved too difficult. And so finally he abandoned that plan as of 1805. And he then decided maybe the best way to deal with the British to bring them to, to heel would be via kind of economic warfare, basically to enforce what we call the Continental System, a European-wide boycott against British goods. And, this is a period where the British are developing their colonial empire. The Industrial Revolution is just beginning to get underway. So the idea that they really did prioritize profit. He once derisively referred to the English as a nation of shopkeepers, though I'm not sure that the British took that as an insult. So there was some merit to this proposed plan. The problem is that when he finally did implement it, it actually proved to be more damaging to the French economy than to the British one. And in large measure, that reflected the difficulty of actually compelling various European countries to comply with the boycott. And so, in some cases, at least ostensibly going along with it, but then, a lot of smuggling going on. But you also had countries like Portugal, for instance, who just at some point refused to comply with the boycott at all. And in fact, that is going to provoke Napoleon to begin planning a military attack against Portugal, kind of the idea of setting an example, right? Putting them in their place and thus hopefully compelling other European states to stay compliant with the Continental System. The problem is that in order to invade Portugal, you have to go through Spain. And in 1807, Napoleon seeks Spain's support for an invasion, basically permission to march his army through Spain on the way to Portugal. And then when Spain refuses, Napoleon decides to direct his campaign against Spain instead. And the campaign is pretty much, from a military point of view, is going to prove successful, right? Napoleon is going to lead the campaign himself. Again, he's a military genius. He pretty much wins every battle that he's involved with, at least up until the very end. The problem is something is beginning to change in the attitudes of the various non-French populations coming under French control. Now, early on, very often Napoleon could count on a certain degree of support among various European populations who really did see him as a kind of liberator, someone bringing these Enlightenment values that was going to bring feudalism to an end, was going to enact reform. And so therefore, very often being supportive, many of them actually fighting in his armies. But something is beginning to change. Increasingly, the French are seen as a foreign occupying force. And what happens in this case, at some point, Napoleon has to leave Spain. Somewhere else in Europe, someone is actually resisting French authority, and so he's going to have to lead a campaign there. And that means leaving other French generals in charge who very often prove to be less than capable. And in this case, a lot of the opposition is going to take the form of guerrilla warfare. And in fact, that term guerrilla, which comes from Spanish meaning small warrior, guerrilla, in the sense that these are not proper soldiers. These are civilians who are now resisting what they see as a foreign occupation. They become particularly incensed when Napoleon puts his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Also reflective of kind of, something significant that's changing in this regard. Up until this point, very often there was little concern about the ethnicity or, whether the ruler spoke the native language, whether he was born there. Whoever ended up on the throne had more to do with kind of interrelations between different royal families and who had a dynastic claim. So this is something new, right? There's a kind of resentment towards Joseph Bonaparte, largely because he's not Spanish and therefore is seen as illegitimate. In any event, this really does represent the emergence of a sense of Spanish nationalism, and wherein this feeling of opposition to a foreign entity acts as a catalyst, right? There's nothing like a them to help define who the us is. And a really good example of the nationalistic character of this opposition is what you see here, a very famous painting by a Spanish painter named Francisco Goya that is painted at the time, right? This is not a historical painting in the sense of something being painted, many decades later looking back. This reflects the kind of sensibility and sentiment that was pervasive among the Spanish people at the time. The title of the painting, The 3rd of May, 1808, and it depicts, an episode related to the Spanish opposition to the French, wherein we see Spanish guerrilla fighters being lined up against a wall and executed by the French. And what's very striking about this painting is how much it humanizes the Spanish guerrilla fighters, even while, in a sense, dehumanizing the French, right? You just see the backs of their heads. You really have no sense of them as individuals or as human beings. Whereas with the Spanish figures, right, you see these very powerful facial expressions of fear and terror and so forth. You know, obviously the painting is meant to generate sympathy for the Spanish. And it is directed at the Spanish population. So why did Napoleon have to leave? Well, in the meantime, Austria had broken its treaty with France, and so Napoleon is now forced to assume command of forces on the Danube and German fronts. And, you know, pretty much every time he heads up the campaign, it proves successful. But then as soon as he puts out that fire, he has to deal with Russia, which now indicates it will no longer comply with the Continental System. And this particular campaign will prove Napoleon's undoing. Now, Napoleon is going to create the biggest army to date to deal with the Russians, his Grande Armée of over 600,000 men. So he is well prepared for his invasion of Russia. And the basic plan is to, you know, just kind of keep marching until you get to Moscow, take control of the capital, and he's quite convinced at that point the Russians would surrender. Unfortunately, it doesn't go as planned. Mostly the Russians just get out of the way of the Grande Armée, very often circling from behind, and then, you know, basically just sniping away at you know, members of Napoleon's army, picking them off here and there, and then finally winter will set in. And when Napoleon does get to Moscow, he finds the city not only abandoned, but burned to the ground. So there he is with a large army, no shelter, no food, winter setting in, which in Russia is a major deal, and eventually forced to retreat. And in the end, losing a tremendous number of men, basically to, as the Russians like to say, General Winter, probably their greatest ally in warfare. By the way, Hitler is going to run into the same problem in the Second World War. But in any event, Napoleon had set out with over 650,000 men. By the time he returned from Russia, he had only 40,000 left. And now Napoleon is on the ropes. And he will now be forced to face the Allied forces, as they're often referred to, this time of the 6th Coalition, under the command of a British officer, Arthur Wellesley, better known as the 1st Duke of Wellington. An individual, by the way, not quite on the same level as Napoleon, but widely considered to be one of the leading military and then later political figures of the first half of the 19th century. And he had risen to prominence over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, eventually reaching the rank of Field Marshal. So he will now head up the Allied forces. And by the way, Napoleon is down but not out by any means. Believe it or not, he is able to put together a sizable army in preparation for the ensuing battle. And that will be the Battle of Dresden, so named because it takes place near the German city of Dresden, which maybe you can see on this map here, a little bit south of Berlin. And this will take place on August 26th, 27th in 1813. And Napoleon will win, but at great cost, right? And at some point, the numbers are, you know, in terms of the various Allied forces coming together in opposition, will simply be overwhelming. And the decisive battle, and finally one where Napoleon experiences defeat, will be the Battle of Leipzig, often referred to as the Battle of the Nations because so many of the European powers are involved. Battle of Leipzig because it takes place near the city of Leipzig, which is very close to Dresden, on October 16th, 19th, 1813. What you see there in the upper right-hand corner is a monument later constructed after German unification to commemorate which at that point will be recast as the German victory over the French. In actual fact, you have individuals coming from various nations fighting on both sides. So Napoleon's still enjoying some support outside of France. As far as the Allied forces, it is a coalition of various European powers, and Napoleon will be defeated. And so the treaty concluding the Napoleonic Wars, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, basically stripping Napoleon Bonaparte of his powers as ruler of the French Empire. And the terms of the treaty finally drawn up on April 11th, 1814. Basically, Napoleon is sent into exile to the island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany in Italy, and in France, the Bourbon monarchy will be restored under Louis XVIII. But Napoleon is not quite done. He will escape from exile from the island of Elba. I always like to imagine that I'm on this ship passing the one carrying Napoleon back to France, and everyone kind of exchanging glasses like, is that Napoleon? So here's the interesting thing, right? Napoleon will land on the southern coast of France. Louis XVIII will send the French army to meet him with the idea that they should arrest him. Instead, they immediately declare their loyalty to Napoleon, escort him back to Paris. In the meantime, Louis XVIII will flee. Louis XVIII, by the way, the brother of Louis XVI, who you might remember was executed at during the French Revolution. And there will be now one final, like really final, conclusive battle for all the money, as it were. And this is the Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18th, 1815. Historians have debated endlessly whether if circumstances had been somewhat different, inclusive of the weather, if perhaps Napoleon might have won, but in actual fact he loses. And this is a very decisive battle. There will be no comeback after this. In fact, very often, if you want to signify someone's utter and ultimate defeat, you might refer to it as their personal Battle of Waterloo. I remember during the Obama presidency, when he first initiated healthcare reform, some Republicans would refer to this as, this will be his Waterloo, like they were quite certain that they would be able to defeat him on the basis of what they perceived to be his very unpopular healthcare reform plan. Though, by the way, it didn't quite turn out that way, but it has become part of the language. In any event, this time, to be really sure that Napoleon doesn't stage a comeback, again they sent him into exile, but this time to a very, very tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the island of St. Helena, where he will while away his days until his death on May 5th, 1821. My understanding is the only way to get to this island today is by ship from South Africa. So, only the most dedicated fan of Napoleon would probably attempt visiting there. What you see to the right is Napoleon's tomb. His body is eventually brought back to Paris. And, French today, I think, have kind of mixed feelings about his legacy. By the way, while he was on the island of St. Helena, he devoted most of his time to writing his memoirs, kind of explaining, why he did what he did, very often trying to make himself look a little bit better, certainly promoting the idea that he was motivated primarily by a desire to bring enlightened reform to Europe. Of course, it is a very important primary source, but one that should be used rather carefully. As far as any lasting impact, we talked about the legal reforms that he initiated. He certainly brought to an end across much of Europe whatever remained of feudalism. One very kind of specific influence had to do with the German states. The Holy Roman Empire is finally gone. He brought it to an end. And in connection with that, he basically oversaw the consolidation of over 100, many of them very small German states, into a smaller number of larger German states, roughly 48 if memory serves, that are now reconstituted as a confederacy, a very kind of loose affiliation of what still are essentially independent German states. But some could argue this is a first step towards eventual German unification. Now, from the point of view of most of Europe's rulers, they're not too happy about a lot of the changes that Napoleon brought about on the continent. In theory, from their perspective, for most of them, if they could undo all of them, they would, but they do recognize that a lot of the changes that he brought about cannot be undone, right? But nonetheless, there is this kind of idea that they need to somehow clean up the mess that Napoleon created in Europe, to undo as much of the changes he brought about as they could. And in order to kind of figure out how to go about that, they're going to come together in what's known as the Congress or Conference of Vienna. So-called essentially because they will meet in Vienna. And from their point of view, this is quite a mess. It's going to take some time to work out how to undo this, right? So they're going to meet between September 1814 up through June 9th, 1815. And there will be a number of European states that will dominate the proceedings, right? That are what today we would refer to as the great powers of Europe. And so I wouldn't expect anyone to remember all these names except for one, and I will point that out when we get to it. But just to give you a sense of who is there, in terms of who matters, you have the Viscount Castlereagh representing the British. And then this is the name you should remember, representing the Austrian Empire, Klemens Wenzel von Metternich, or Metternich is sufficient. He will probably be the dominant voice at the conference. And not because somehow Austria is the dominant power. This really reflects more his own individual charisma and clout as a diplomat. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about him as we move forward. But before we do, we also have Russia, represented by the Tsar himself, Alexander I. And actually, for most people living in Vienna, the prospect of a Tsar actually showing up in person, that would have been quite exciting, kind of like a major celebrity showing up. Yeah, at this time, almost kind of a mythical air around these, kind of all-powerful rulers of this vast empire, Russian Empire. And then also representing Prussia, we have Frederick William III, or perhaps more correctly, Friedrich Wilhelm III. By the way, if you come across a ruler who, is some combination of Frederick and or William, you're probably talking about Prussia during this time period. And then we should also note that even though France technically does not have a seat at the table, right, the general attitude of the great powers of Europe is that you created this mess. You are to be seen, not heard. We will come up with the terms of whatever settlement we arrive at. You will simply sign off on them. But in actual fact, in a kind of informal capacity, France will have representation in the person of one Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Very often just simply known as Talleyrand. He had actually served as a French diplomat under Napoleon, though now he claims he had done so unwillingly. And he is just simply a very charismatic fellow, has something of what we might call a silver tongue, very good at insinuating himself into conversations. And in many respects, he will really greatly influence the plan that is eventually adopted at the Congress, which by and large aims at restoring things as much as possible to the way they were pre-Napoleon, even pre-French Revolution, right? So that would start with borders and governments, right? Trying to restore borders to what they were prior to Napoleon. Again, they realized some of what had been done can't be undone. So the Holy Roman Empire is definitely still gone, and really no one sees the virtue in bringing it back. They're not going to try to unconsolidate what was done with the German states, but definitely trying to restore, monarchs who perhaps had been removed, sometimes in favor of a sibling of Napoleon, and to restore governments as much as possible. The great powers also decide that it might be a good idea if we periodically met and consulted with one another, right, to try and maintain the status quo, right? So part one is restoring things as much as possible to how they were before Napoleon. Part two is keeping things that way, right? And what's really important here is they recognize that the genie is out of the bottle, right? I mean, in terms of all these ideas about how government should function, that had come out of the Enlightenment, This stuff is out there now. It's been tremendously spread. People have had some experience in terms of the reforms initiated by Napoleon. And also, in addition to that, we're starting to see a growing pervasiveness of nationalist ideological thought, right? As, increasingly ideas about, who constitutes the nation, the idea that government should somehow represent the nation and so forth. And that actually will be the subject of our next lecture, so I won't go too far into that. But there really is this concern, right, that there's all this potential for revolution out there. We need to keep an eye on it and try to squelch it, wherever we see it beginning to emerge, right? Nip it in the bud before it can become a major problem. And this requires a certain degree of collaboration. So there will be other congresses following the one in Vienna. Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818, and then in Tropo, 1820, Laibach in 1821, Verona in the north of what today is Italy in 1822. This actually does represent a kind of shift away from the balance of power approach towards international cooperation. Something really that had never been seen on this level before. And so very often they refer to this system of kind of cooperation as the concert of Europe, or Congress system, right? In the sense that periodically the great powers meet at these congresses. And this becomes, in a sense, an alternative method of collective security to that of the balance of power. Now, balance of power is still out there, and eventually it will reassert itself. But it is kind of interesting to consider that, at this point, there is in some ways a greater or at least equal concern with ideological movements that are beginning to take place in Europe than with what other political figures are doing. In any event, this is roughly what we end up with in Europe after the Congress of Vienna in terms of restored borders. Again, really not undoing some of the changes in the center with respect to the various German states, but certainly, as far as borders, but definitely trying to restore monarchical forms of government wherever they had either been removed or where the monarch in question had been replaced by Napoleon, often again with one of his siblings. And in connection with the Congress system and this kind of a desire to prevent revolutionary activity from spreading, right? The idea of like even nipping it in the bud wherever it might manifest itself, the driving force will be Metternich, right? Or more properly, Prince Klemens Wenzel von Metternich, who, he's not a ruler. Sometimes he has a very important diplomatic position in Austria, sometimes not, but he does become probably the most influential political figure over the next 30 years, sometimes called the Age of Metternich up until 1848. He pretty much had led the negotiations at the Congress of Vienna, and he pretty much defines the basis, like why is it that we need to prevent revolutionary ideas connected with the Enlightenment or connected with nationalism from spreading. He is the driving force behind what we call reactionary conservatism, right, which basically seeks to protect the rights of kings and emperors against revolutionary ideals, right? So just to kind of unpackage that term a little bit, reactionary conservatism, right? Conservatism, well, think of the word to conserve, right? To keep things the way they are. And this actually does mark the beginning of conservatism as a proper political ideology, such as, for instance, we have in the United States today. The reactionary part of that kind of reflects the fact that it's not really proactive. It's not trying to initiate, obviously it's not trying to initiate change, right? It kind of stands against change. It is more reacting to change that is already underway, right? The idea of, anytime some kind of revolutionary activity is taking place that's promoting change, to try and react to that by stamping it out. So what is conservatism in an ideological sense, right? And what is it specifically Metternich believed in the sense that he was so opposed to revolutionary change, right? It's not just about clinging on to raw power. He honestly felt that maintaining certain institutions like the monarchy, to some degree, social hierarchies tied to the, kind of the idea that the nobility should enjoy a privileged status, and the place of the Catholic Church, where it remained prominent, was in the best interest of Europe as a whole, right? So, for instance, with monarchy, it had nothing to do with, a belief in the divine right of monarchy. He simply felt that monarchy was the only form of government able to ensure continuity and stability in human affairs. And monarchy is kind of the linchpin holding the whole thing together, right? It guarantees all other social institutions. So, for instance, if in a particular kingdom the Catholic Church has a prominent role, it's tied to monarchy. The king, in a sense, upholds its status as such, right? The social hierarchy depends on the monarchy. And he really felt that, kind of the driving principle of this is if an institution has been around for a long time, there's probably a good reason for it. And if you simply try to do away with it, it's probably going to be incredibly disruptive to the entire social and political system in a way that will do immense harm to everyone. And so, for instance, he would look at the French Revolution, right, which, essentially, particularly when you get to, the more radical period, right, with the Reign of Terror and everything, literally trying to wipe the slate clean, just do away with all existing political institutions, the monarchy, the role of the church, kind of the social hierarchy, and create something completely new based on abstract ideas. And he would argue that is exactly why it became so radical and so violent and so many people ended up being killed, right? It wasn't, if you have institutions that have been around for a while, there's probably a good reason for it. If you try to remove it, it's like pulling a thread out of a Persian rug. There's a good chance the whole thing is going to unspool, right? And, he's kind of looking at other revolutions that are starting to emerge in Europe. For instance, there's going to be a Greek uprising against Ottoman rule on the basis of Greek nationalism, which many Europeans, by the way, are sympathetic to because, kind of feels like a Christian European people rising up against their Muslim Ottoman overlords. But he, in fact, opposes it. Is simply on the basis of this conservative principle, right? He's like, the Greeks had been part of the Ottoman Empire for ages. It's not necessarily that you can't have change, but it has to be gradual and it has to build on what's already there. Otherwise, in his opinion, it is illegitimate. They must, any change that you're talking about must reflect existing traditions in history. Otherwise, they're going to be disruptive and violent. And, if you think about how things did eventually go down with the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, the fact that France is going to go, through constitutions, one after the other, like some people go through tissue paper, maybe he had a point. Now, we should note, and we're going to kind of wrap up our discussion with this, Metternich is a political figure. He is not a philosopher, an intellectual, so he is not really going to define the philosophical or ideological underpinnings of conservatism. Another fellow named Edmund Burke is going to do that. So today we might even refer to him as the father of conservatism. Now, what's interesting is he is British, in fact Irish, but serving in the Parliament. So he's a minister in the House of Commons, and he is going to formulate the kind of ideological underpinning of conservatism as we know it today. So, one fact that I think helps you to understand his thinking in this regard is that he supported the American Revolution in its dispute with King George III, and this is well after the to some degree he was, kind of a contemporary of that, but then writing about it after the fact. But he was strongly opposed to the French Revolution. And, upon first hearing that, that might seem odd. Like, well, weren't they kind of both fighting for the same thing? Kind of wanting to have representative government, kind of very similar principles. We talked about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, very similar to the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. In both cases, revolutions are heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, but he felt there was a very important distinction in terms of why, to his mind, the American Revolution was legitimate and the French Revolution not. And it simply came down to this. To his mind, the American Revolution was building on a trajectory that was already underway. It was building on existing institutions. First of all, you already had representative government in Britain. And, one of the main grievances of the American colonists was, no taxation without representation. But, the idea that principle was already well established in British and by extension colonial government. Furthermore, you did have representative bodies in the American colonies. So by the time of the American Revolution, there already was a long established tradition with respect to representative government, or shall we say self-government, right? So to his mind, the American Revolution was simply the next step in this trajectory. The French Revolution went from absolute monarchy to his mind, complete chaos, because it was trying to create something completely new out of thin air, right? It wasn't building on anything that was already there. Maybe it kind of started off with the idea of constitutional monarchy, so you could make the case that, even though it did represent dramatic change, it was kind of building on something that already existed. But it ended up in a place where it was trying to create something completely new that had no precedence, either in terms of the French political system, French history, however you want to frame it, right? So the main point is, it is about continuity. Conservative thought gives emphasis to the historical conditioning of social institutions, right? If you have these institutions, they have evolved over a long period of time. And they have evolved in a way that addresses the needs of society. And if you simply do away with them, it will probably have many unintended consequences, right? And he saw this as a corrective to what he perceived to be the anti-historical outlook associated with the Enlightenment. I mean, they were coming up with all these ideas about representative government simply based on abstract ideas about, different kind of systems of morality, what on paper looked very workable, but didn't necessarily reflect any existing traditions, political traditions, or the actual history of institutions, right? And the French Revolution for Edmund Burke was the worst example of this. It marked, again, a complete break with the past and with existing institutions, right? So for conservatives, you have to have this kind of legitimacy principle in play when you're evaluating whether a type of change you're considering is good, or whether in fact you're promoting keeping things the same way, right? So this legitimacy principle, for those at the Congress of Vienna, for people like Metternich, justified, among other things, the reinstallation of the Bourbon monarchy in France under Louis XVIII. So here we go, right? French Revolution went through many different phases, ended up with Napoleon, and then finally we come to the point where the Bourbon monarchy is back in place. Some of the reforms associated with the French Revolution will remain. But by the way, the story in France is not yet done. There are more revolutions to come, more constitutions. And in fact, even today, I think the French take great pride in their willingness to take to the streets, to form barricades, and to bring about revolutionary change. So we'll stop there. We're going to be looking at some of these revolutions in the context of the spread of nationalism across Europe shortly. But in any event, that ends this week's lecture.